Welcome to the Books Applied podcast, presented by WSL Leadership. In this podcast, we talk about an awesome book and how to apply it to your work, sport, or life. I'm your host, Iggy Perillo. Thanks for joining me. Today, we'll be talking about the book Wait, The Art and Science of Delay by Frank Portnoy, and I'm speaking with Dan Miller of Fifth Pillar Consulting, who introduced this book to me. Dan, it's so great to have you here.
It's great to be here, Iggy. Thanks for the invitation.
How did you come across this book? I came across this book because of you, because you recommended it, which was a great thing to do. How did you come across this, or how did this book enter your life?
So I actually engaged with some friends of mine in a book club at the beginning of the pandemic to help pass the time and create some connection to other human beings. And Wait was probably the second or third book. It was a book club focused on kind of experiential education and facilitation and stuff. But it was recommended by John Losey, who I know you know.
I do.
And so I read it with him and a couple other friends of mine and processed it week by week until we were all done. And it was one of those books that after I read it, it was hard to think about things the same way as I did prior to reading it. So I got excited about it. And as you know, when I get excited about things, I have to tell people, and so I told you, and here we are.
And here we are. Do you want to talk a brief second about Fifth Pillar Consulting and how that led you to, how this book relates to your work a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. So Fifth Pillar Consulting is my company. We are dedicated to safety and quality and experiential education. Sometimes that looks like experiential program risk management consulting. Sometimes that looks like just facilitation and leadership development. Sometimes that looks like train the trainer kind of stuff. But it's all a love note to Outward Bound, Iggy, where you and I both got some of our start. And
I know, deep cut. We both met in what year? In the early 2000s?
It was like 2004, maybe 2005.
Minnesota. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And we didn't talk for like 20 years.
More than that. Yeah, for sure. A long time. Not because we hated each other, because we just went our other ways and worked other places. But yeah.
Yeah. So Fifth Pillar is a little bit of a love note to the four pillars of Outward Bound, and how sometimes when you got something good, you got to share it with the rest of the world. So that's kind of the fifth pillar.
Fantastic. I can really see how this book relates to risk management there's so many clear connections there. But anyway, that's getting ahead of ourselves. What did you find? That's what I think you found exciting about this book, or you, whatever. But what did you find interesting or useful in this book?
Yeah, that's certainly one of them. I'll say the first thing that I really liked about this book, I generally am attracted to books that are intuitive for me. Like they take concepts that I know or have experienced and give them names and maybe have some data to help back them up. And that's always really interesting to me. The title of this book about the art and science of delay, and when somebody explained it to me as, he's basically saying it's best to just wait till the very last possible minute in order to make a decision, is extremely counterintuitive to me. So unlike most of the books I go after, this one was like, I don't buy into this immediately. I'm going to see if he can, sell me on this concept of delaying decision making. And he was pretty successful, I got to say, in the idea of waiting till the very last possible second to make a decision. What I really like about that is it just eases some level of like stress or anxiety around decision making. So here's the difference, right? I read the book and now here's what I do.
Yes. How did it change your life?
This is the difference, is that now whenever we're like, I was been trying to buy a car. Trying to get a new car or a newer car for the past, 8 months. Looking at cars, which has often been a stressful experience for me. When I've been looking at cars after reading this book, I'm like, I don't have to make a decision. I am in the information gathering phase of this process.
Right.
And so I don't give myself that pressure of having to make a decision, because I'm just gathering information and I have not yet reached the decision point. And when I finally do, maybe that's the place to have a little bit of stress or anxiety, because I care about the decisions that I make. but I don't have to carry that throughout the entire information gathering process, which just makes my life a little smoother.
And that is great. That's a great application, like immediate real life application of these ideas. And I think part of it is like he gets really into the nitty gritty of this. This isn't just like a 2-page, pamphlet. This is a book about decision making and this idea of delay. And one of the things he says is that optimizing delay is different than minimizing delay. And so sort of this book is a lot about how to use delay to your advantage, right? And so it sounds like from your story, you're embracing delay as a way to reduce stress in this car buying process. Because you're like, oh, I'm just gathering information. I don't need to decide right now. I think there's often pressure to decide right now or, make a strong decision.
From car salesmen.
Oh, yep. Yes, that is true. And I think, and he makes this other distinction around when it's good to delay and when it's not. One of the many distinctions is around experts and novices. I don't know if you remember this part, but he says an expert doesn't need to delay a decision, but a novice needs to delay as long as possible. Like, it sounds like you're probably not maybe a car salesperson or maybe not a mechanic or maybe not a super duper gearhead where you could just look at a car and make an immediate expert decision, right? It sounds like from your story. And
this is accurate.
Okay, great. I mean, I don't want to assume too much, but good. Accurate assumption number one. But it's important to know when you're an expert and when you're not. So, and experts will, it's hard for experts to admit when they're in areas where they're a novice. So if you're used to being an expert in one area, it's hard for us to be like, oh, I'm a novice there. And then he goes on to say, novices are often better at doing nothing at all. Like just not deciding. It sounds like you need a car. So eventually you're going to come to a decision. It's maybe not something you can put off indefinitely and just be like, or maybe you're like, I'm going to be carless. Maybe that doesn't work for you. So the decision is coming, but putting it off as long as possible is a really, embraces this sort of novice mentality and this very open sense of I'm learning, I'm taking in information versus I'm an expert. This is what we need to do. This is an appendicitis, take it out. Like whatever it is, if you have expert knowledge and expert skills. I've done this 400 times, great. And I would say appendicitis is not incredibly easy to diagnose, so not a great example. But I think there are areas and spaces where people are experts and have expertise. And I suspect once you're in your brain of your work and you're like, I'm looking at this, how this course was built or how this training plan works out, and you're like, this is not going to work out well. You get that. You get that sort of instant read on things because you're an expert at it. You've looked through risk management pieces for a long time. You know what is standard practice. You know what isn't. And you can easily make that discernment. But if you were a novice at it, which would not be awesome in that role, to be like, well, I'm just going to try and figure it out and or delay as long as possible. That doesn't make a great business model for one thing, if people are just wondering when they're going to get the information down the road. But in reality, buying a car, if you're not an expert, delay that out as long as possible. That delay is beneficial to you.
Absolutely. Yeah. And when I ended up actually buying the car was when I broke down on the highway with my entire family just outside of Brunswick, Georgia.
Oh.
And then it was decision time.
That's when it happened.
So we just made it. But, aside from the car story, what you're saying, Iggy, definitely rings very true in the field of risk management and outdoor education in general, specifically when you transition. Like you can transition from being an expert to a novice when you're in the field by taking 3 steps uphill, like all of a sudden you're in a new environment and you may have been an expert when you're, in the forest, but you're not an expert at alpine mountaineering. And now you've stepped out of the tree line. And that's an area where a lot of people apply the same patterns and practices that they were using back when they were an expert. Right.
Oh, yeah.
Make that decision, go with our gut, and move. Where noticing those transitions is I've seen the most difficult pieces for outdoor educators and program managers is when are we all of a sudden outside the boundaries of our expertise?
Mm-hmm. I went to a whole training on just the transition zone, they called it, and recognizing that when you're in a transition zone, even if it's from wet to dry, if you're in a boat stepping onto the land, that's like an obvious transition zone, right? From the boat to the land. Or I love your example of from the forest to like a alpine environment that may not have trees all of a sudden, or flat water to moving water. There's a transition there. My analogies are all gonna be boating. Yours are all gonna be forest. It's gonna be perfect. We're gonna cruise right along with this. But the idea of, if you don't recognize that a transition is happening, and the training was actually a risk management training around the most accidents happen during the transition zone. Like we don't recognize it soon enough that a change has happened. And so we're using our old mentality, our old ways, our old, our previous expertise. And I think it also, it's super is in alignment with this book and the idea of recognizing when you're a novice and where you're the expert. And that transition zone is where you're going to screw it up maybe first, or you sort of plod along longer and then you're applying the wrong idea to the wrong environment, essentially the wrong situation. And that does not always go very well, for sure.
Yeah. And then, if you have a catastrophic situation going on, I think the terminology is sometimes it's don't just do something, stand there.
Oh yeah.
Right? Or take a mental cigarette break, even though the worst thing that you could ever imagine is happening right now all around you. The best thing you can do at that moment is just take a second, right? One of the models that Frank Portnoy points to in this book is the OODA, right? The Army, the jet fighter pilot model.
Side note, John Boyd, the guy who wrote that, the book about him is amazing. I actually just looked it up. John Boyd, it's called John Boyd, the fighter pilot who changed the art of war. Such a good book. Anyway, I recommend. And go on though, but the OODA loop is his thing. Yes.
Right. Taking a second to observe and orient first. Whereas some folks, probably especially, somebody who's like just been through their woofer training, did a big scenario, and now they feel like, all right, I've got the certification and I'm ready to deal with emergencies. And then as soon as it happens, they just act, right? And they might miss something. So it's a metaphor for life, but just taking the time to really gather the data is something that can be hard to do. And there's a lot of pressure, I think, in our world to not take that time and just act really quickly and impulsively.
Absolutely. And for folks who don't know, WFR is Wilderness First Responder Training. So that is people who have medical training to take action, to literally, it's your job to step up when a medical situation happens in a wilderness context. So things are going to be not in the city environment where you can just dial up 911 and get anything to happen very quickly. So the whole training is about what do you do? What do you do? What do you do when this happens? And the first part is always this sort of scene size up, like any sort of first aid training I've ever been at. Great, you're there to help. You're there to provide care, or do CPR, whatever it is. Cool, size up the scene first, which is really forcing you to take the step of being aware, bringing some awareness first. That observation is always the first step of these checklists, essentially, that you have to go through. What is actually going on here? Is this even safe for me to go into? What is the scene? Who's here? And that forces you that step back to slow down. And I think I don't know if it's EMTs or someone they talk about, the novice is the one running and the pro is the one walking, right? When there's a call for an ambulance or firefighter or anyone, the novice is like, I gotta go get there. And they're sprinting, which the problems with that are not only are you not observing the scene around you, but you're elevating your heart rate and putting yourself in a poor state for making really fine distinctions and really fine thinking when your heart rate is super elevated. I think it's over 100 beats per minute. You can't totally dial into really fine details, like recognizing facial expression is a fine detail, higher order thinking, or recognizing other aspects that might be happening there, more subtle or more nuanced cues to things. So the sprinting, you don't want the sprinting paramedic, the sprinting doctor to show up on the scene, the sprinting first responder. No, that's not awesome in a lot of ways for your care, but it's counterintuitive because we think we want that person there right now, but they're not going to be showing up in a great state if they sprint.
They're not going to notice the timber rattlesnake that's still sitting there having just bitten this victim. And that's why he's unconscious on the ground right now.
Yes.
About to step on top of it. Yeah.
I do love the OODA loop too. And that's observe, orient, and then the D stands for decide, and then act. Like you even break it down. You don't just observe and then orient yourself to what's happening. Then you have to actually actively decide, and then you take action. Like action is the last step of what you even do. And that repeats over and over. That's a cycle. So once you act, then you're observing again, or reorienting, redeciding. Mm-hmm. I think I wrote a little note that goes with this, and that's within, and so this was designed in a very military context, John Boyd, fighter pilot. And so he says you do this within your adversary's timeline, but not necessarily, like you don't necessarily act on their timeline, but you observe and do these steps within their timeline. So I have to be observing them, not for my own timeline, which might be really slow or really long comparatively. So I have to adjust my timeline to my adversary in this combat sort of scenario, which I think really speaks to orienting phase is not just what else is going on around here. What's the pace of this situation too? And that's where delay comes in. Do I need to slow down, observe, and slow down and orient to many more factors maybe than I would have already thought of when I'm all gung-ho to jump in immediately?
Bringing it to the facilitation world a little bit, what was the book? One of the other books we read in this book club is called Teams for a New Generation, Greg Robinson and Mark Rose. And it's kind of a sleeper facilitation handbook. But one of the things they talk about is just like typical behaviors during times of confusion or uncertainty. And one of the behaviors that I see all the time as a facilitator is just getting busy. That there's this feel good feeling that comes up when you're like, oh my gosh, there's some stuff going on. I better do something.
Right.
So you just you find some sticks and you start tying them together and you're just like, oh, I'm doing something. This must be helpful. And in facilitation, you give somebody kind of an ambiguous task to complete. And there's always a handful of people that just immediately start doing something. Because it just makes them feel better. When probably in that ambiguous situation, your best bet is going to be just to take stock of the situation for a little while, process a little bit. There's a fine line between analysis paralysis and just acting too fast. But that getting busy urge that people have, I think, is often counterproductive when it comes to
I've heard it called ready, fire, aim as the steps.
Right. Or just fire.
Yeah. This fire all day. I think I definitely have seen that happen where people, you're right. They totally feel better when they're actively doing something, and somehow observing and orienting, like those OODA loop steps, don't feel active enough. Like they want to jump right to, step 4, which is act. And it does not always go well. And let alone it doesn't always, you're not oriented to the rest of your team. I think we both work with groups often. And so observing is one thing, and that's great. And then maybe they observe really fast and they feel like an expert. It's like, I know what we need to do. And they just go off and do it. The rest of the team is like, what are they doing? Where did they go? What is even happening over there? The team is not oriented to each other or their plan or what's going on together in those situations sometimes where you have the actors, the doers just going and doing and trying things out, for sure. That's very funny. That's
great. If you're an expert, that's the tactic. But I guarantee you these people are not experts in the weird contrived experiences that we're setting up for them, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think sometimes when I'm just even in conversation with folks and they always have the quick answer, I'm like, have you thought about this? And maybe I'm asking a question they've heard before, so it's a quick answer. There's not a lot of deep processing that needs to happen. But I think part of the art of facilitation is to get to those deeper answers. And when I know we both have seen this happen, where you're like, what did you use to, how did you work through this out? They're like, oh, teamwork and communication. You're like, cool, boring. Like we hear that nonstop, teamwork, communication, great. But what does that mean? We have to sort of pull that apart because those are the easy answers at sometimes, which are superficial, and people want to, move to the next thing. Teamwork is really complicated and really multifaceted, and what it looks like for your team, what it looks like in this situation, in this scenario with these people on this day, all those factors are informative and insightful, when often you can just say teamwork, check, we did it. Teamwork is done. We're over that now. You're like, oh no, bad scene.
Yeah, it's really nice sometimes when people take a moment to create a thoughtful response to those kind of questions. And I remember those. I never remember who spoke first, or just, it's not powerful to be the first one that answers a question. It's definitely powerful to give a thoughtful response.
Which I think is an interesting another take on waiting, right? We tend to, so this book is like, yes, you should delay unless you're an expert, which you're probably not. So get over yourself, have some humility, delay for a little bit as long as possible. Yet often the person who speaks up first, the loudest first talker, carries more sway with a group of people often, or has more influence in different ways and in different environments. And that doesn't, this to me calls to mind a lot of what Susan Cain wrote about in the book Quiet, how the introvert sort of personality type that she's talking about is primed for delay and primed for observation and wants to sort of step back and take things in and process and organize their thoughts a little bit before they speak or before they bring ideas forward. Meanwhile, this extrovert in her sort of schema, blurts it out. It's like, we're going to do this. Here's a great idea. Blah, is like big energy, but out there energy very fast. And people sort of in American culture tend to gravitate toward that extrovert personality because like, oh, they come across as confident. They come across as knowledgeable. They come across as a leader, quote, air quotes, all these different things. When in reality, they haven't really thought about what's going on most likely, or they are just talking first doesn't mean it's a good idea at all. There's no quality control on the first idea that comes for even later ideas, or then pausing from taking action on that idea and going through the OODA loop, for example, and taking some time to step back from that. To insert delay later is another part that Portnoy talks about. Cool, you have something happening. Where can you put in delays to make yourself stop and think, make yourself stop and be aware of what's happening, or just give yourself more time to do the work and more time to, look for the car, more time to look for those pieces of whatever it is, pieces to the puzzle that you're putting together.
Yeah, that's great advice for facilitators and trainers as well. And speaking for myself, no matter how hard I try, like over programming seems to be an issue. I don't know if you deal with the same thing or you've mastered that yet, but there's always more stuff on the paper than will ever happen in real life.
Oh yeah, constantly.
But I mean, that's part of my planning and that's part of what feels good. But in kind of relation to what this book is talking about, that plan, that agenda, whatever it is that I've made up is not the same thing as my decision. Right? And letting go of plans is something I do feel like an expert at because I do it all the time. I make really good plans and then I abandon them because of what's happening in the moment. And I think for facilitators and trainers and instructors, when you get into that place where you're just comfortable with a little bit of silence, you're comfortable with expanding the time that someone can take for just individual reflection or journaling or drawing a picture, in addition to, the more common cadence of just like activity, sit in a circle, debrief. Whoever says the answer first, that is the one we wanted. Great, we got it. Now we can move on to the next thing. Is much less powerful an experience for people and one that is paced appropriately. And I think in addition to that, sometimes having the I don't know what it is. I'll say courage to just step back and step out of the process as a facilitator. That's where I've found most of the magic happens when working with groups. And it's usually because I may have made a schedule, but it wasn't my decision at that moment to actually follow it.
There's a quote from the book that you're bringing to mind, that efficiency goes with clock time, but effectiveness goes with event time. And event time and clock time are very different things, right? We can look at the watch and be like, cool, we have 10 minutes for this conversation, whatever it is. But the event time as it unfolds is very different than the clock time as it proceeds. And so to give your folks space to engage in that event in event time without superimposing clock time, I think a lot of times you're absolutely right. It looks like more delay and more weight and more space and spaciousness within a schedule versus, cool, we're going to do 47 things today. Maybe we'll just do 10 things today and we're going to engage with those on event time and see where this event takes us versus we're on clock time. I need to get through my 47 things. Let's go, and kind of cramming them in there. It's a very different feel to how a group works together or how an individual conversation works out with someone, because the conversation as it unfolds, as it's going, you're still creating the path as you go versus here's my 12 topics. We're going to get through them. We're done,
Good facilitator is like a detective. Right. And then
absolutely.
And a good detective stays in that information gathering space as long as they can.
Oh, yeah. It's always like the last chapter where you're like, hey, here's who did it. It was the candlestick. It was this chick over here. We're out. And so you're like, oh, my gosh. But you've had, whatever. I had a experience of reading a lot of Agatha Christie books recently. And there is, it's a book, right? It's constructed. It's a setup. But you have an engaging, 20 chapters of what's going on in this piece and this piece. It forces you to slow down in some ways to get all this data. And you're making guesses, you're trying to figure it out or whatever. But it's not until the last chapter where here's your clue, here it is. Like we put it together for you. And I think that it's like those like mystery books force you to embrace the delay in a certain way, and it's actually fun. It's actually enjoyable to embrace it in a story. And I think that's also another art to facilitation, is to make sure the story is coherent for people. It's hard to delay things when we don't know quite where we're going or we don't know quite what's happening. That's when it feels uncomfortable. If we're I think we also have this feel of being in a holding pattern. Like, well, when is I'm not sure. That can be uncomfortable too. Which is different than a delay where I'm giving space and spaciousness for something to happen. If I'm in an unknown, like indeterminate situation that's unknown enough that I don't quite get where we're going or what's happening, that is, I think, where delay feels frustrating for a lot of folks. Right.
We'd rather ride the wave than miss the wave completely.
Right.
And just watch this beautiful wave go by. That's totally a surfer reference from my time growing up in Florida. But
awesome.
I think that's what I hear you saying is like, yeah, you got to stay on that wave and ride it.
Right. You can't delay too much. There's another quote that when you were just mentioning planning, where Portnoy says, there's a tendency in our planning to confuse the unfamiliar with the impossible, which I thought was another great quote.
Yeah. Oh, I hear that all the time. Mm-hmm. That's impossible. And then people do it.
Yeah. When in reality, it's just unfamiliar, right?
Yeah.
And I think the delay makes the unfamiliar possible. Like, that's sort of the next piece of this, right? If we have something totally unfamiliar, mysterious, we both work in a space where often we give people an incredibly novel challenge to do or to work on, or something that they haven't encountered before, or an experience that they intentionally seek out because they want something new or something different. And it does, like, I know we've heard people say that's impossible. I could never do that. That's impossible. Like, that, it's a pretty common mantra when you show someone something that's really unfamiliar and maybe seems intimidating and maybe seems scary or seems just out of how they operate in their world and their life and their times. Like, I'm normally on the ground. You want me to climb up this tree, this tower, this pole, whatever it is. I don't, that's impossible, just because they have no concept of doing that, but they delay. And I think there's this part where in the facilitation world, too much delay, it can be self-defeating. You're like, oh, I've talked myself out of it, versus like, oh, I delayed enough to sort of talk myself into it. And so I'm just curious how you manage that piece of delay. Like, how do you know when the right amount of delay is, I suppose? Because I know we both have spaces where we can influence how much delay we create or don't create for people.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of factors on that. If I'm not on anybody else's schedule, then I'll delay all day. Like, I'll just allow space, because I think that important things happen for individuals, especially like individuals going through it. Even if you're working with a group and you have a lot of different pieces going on, I think it's the in-between times where the individual processing and a lot of that kind of drawing connections to their own lived experience, that's when that happens. So I'll let that happen all day unless I'm on somebody else's schedule.
Unless you have event time, unless you got to follow event time, right?
It's a bummer, but if we only are able to use this ropes course for 2 hours, then I'm probably going to be a little pushier for someone who is stuck, because potentially that means somebody else doesn't even get to climb, or go up in the air. I'll be a little more pushy, but man, I love it when I'm not in that kind of rush and we can just, hey, this is happening. Like, let's live in this moment and figure out what to do. Right. It's maybe sometimes Mother Nature just gives us the perfect delay. One of my favorite memories of working in the wilderness, was just sitting in lightning drills.
Right.
For somebody who doesn't have that experience of running thousands of days of wilderness trips, when lightning comes, everything just stops. Right.
Yeah, we're not going to expose ourselves to being hit by lightning. That's good practice.
Special lightning position. And sometimes, especially in Florida, I used to do a lot of river trips in Florida. Like, you sit there for hours while lightning and rain just boom all around you and come down. And those, like, I have seriously beautiful, wonderful memories from those times. It was just me sitting on a gear bag or a backpack immersed in a lightning storm. And I'm grateful for those opportunities to just sit and wait it out, because in that situation, until hypothermia starts kicking in or people haven't eaten for 8 hours, like in that situation, the best thing you can do is nothing.
Forced delay. It's so great in some ways.
Yeah, I love it when sometimes these exterior forces just cause us to stop. Like, I was going to do a lot of work today, but my internet went out.
Mm-hmm.
And so now I'm just going to like go get some sun and jump on a trampoline. And it's like all of a sudden, because of that delaying something else, I find the important things in my life becoming more important.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. It also makes me think about subconscious goal attainment. When we're not like super focused on something, our brain is still putting pieces together, working in the background, building connections. We don't have to always be intentionally conscious about the work we're doing. And most likely after you stayed in the sun and jumped on the trampoline for a while and did not, weren't on screen, weren't, fingers typing for the day of no internet, I suspect your work the next day was probably better. You're probably more refreshed. I suspect your ideas click together in that subconscious way. Like that delay does a lot of work that's not always extremely obvious or extremely tangible and still extremely valuable.
Yeah. Whenever I get to postpone work and increase play, it's good, I'm sure.
Yes. I'm all for play, for sure. For sure. Man, I feel like we've covered a lot of things in this conversation. Are there any other parts of the book that jumped out at you that you want to make sure we talk about?
Yeah, well, one that I was really encouraged by. So there's a section on, I don't remember exactly what the section was on, but it was talking about bias in medical doctors and how there's just very clear research that shows that doctors, by and large, treat white people and black people a little differently, and are more likely to recommend treatment for a white person. And they did some research on this, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I told you I lent the book to somebody and it's been like 2 months since I read it.
Yeah, it's all right. It's all right.
I'm fairly certain there was a small piece that said when we helped these individuals become aware of their bias, that alone changed the numbers, like moved the needle and reducing that disparity. And that I found to be a beautiful little nugget in the book. That just like, I think it was actually you, Iggy, that sent me a link to a implicit bias survey.
Yes. Yeah.
Pretty recently. And I went to it and I took the survey.
Oh, yeah.
And it revealed some hard truths. And it made me think about this, that, just sitting face to face with your own bias, especially if you're able to see the data that confirms, like you can't argue with, that in and of itself helps you move past your bias, or at least helps you act in a way that is less biased. Yeah. And I love that. And I think that's something everybody needs to know, that if we can come face to face with our bias, that will help move the needle in our actions being more equitable and just. And I think that's an important part of the book that needs some airtime.
Absolutely. That's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up. And they did a lot of research on this with doctors. It's super documented. I think they had looked at a study with hypertension meds. And so they could really, and in the medical setting, you have the chart notes, like you have the reading of every blood pressure reading, every heart rate reading, there's just tons and tons and tons of data. And so they could look at who this set of data and this set of data, who got the meds for hypertension and who didn't. And it broke down pretty, it wasn't, 100% to 0%, white people versus black people getting the hypertension meds, but there was a beyond statistical difference in terms of, for the same categories of data, who would get medical treatment and who wouldn't, medication in this setting. And, then they inform people. And the doctors, of course, are like, of course I'm not biased. Of course I want to treat everyone. Of course, they didn't just do a survey and find racist doctors somehow to do this with, right? They were surveying a broad amount of doctors who, like most people we know, would say, of course I don't have bias. Of course I'm not racist. Of course I care about people who look like me and people who don't look like me. Of course. And so then they can show them the stats and be like, look, and I don't remember if they actually showed specific doctors their stats too, doctors in a certain field, or if they just kind of showed the general data set and we're like, whoa, doctors have implicit bias too. And I think I sent you to I know it's like IATA is the acronym for it for some reason. I don't know what the acronym stands for, but it's the implicit bias assessment test. And like many online tests you could do, you sort of are just guessing and filling in bubbles. But this one, it measures your reaction time. So it's a little more scientifically gauged to how well you react to different pairs being put together versus different pairs of words being put together. It's hard to explain. I recommend it because, again, it is painful in a way to be told, by the way, you have these biases. And it's not just implicit racial bias in that one. There's gender bias. There's, I think, gender identity biases. There's all different types of categories that are contained within that survey. And that's for research purposes. Like they're trying to gather data about it, and you get your little report. But yeah, exactly. But once you recognize you have implicit, for this study with the doctors, if you have implicit racial bias, you should know that fact and think about it. And that part of just thinking about it, like, oh, I might have implicit racial bias. Yeah, dramatically changed sort of the trajectory of those doctors in terms of how they're prescribing what happened, which was basically their treatment plans for folks. And even though no one would have said like, oh yeah, I'm not a racist. No one said they were a racist in the beginning. No one said anyone was. It's okay. And their treatment plan changed because they thought about it. Like, am I being biased here? I think was probably a question. I can imagine them thinking, wait, I need to make sure I'm not acting out of bias here, or I need to just call some awareness to this facet of what's happening in this situation.
Yeah, to me, that's the orient, right? That's the second you observe. And then when you're orienting, you're trying to put it together. Like, how does what I'm seeing line up with what I already know, and what are my biases? What are my blind spots? And taking a moment to enter those into the equation before you decide. I think when we skip the orientation step, that's often when we act in the most biased ways because we're just acting fast, which is so likely to play on all of those, human decision-making fallacies.
Absolutely. And I think this just speaks to, I don't actually remember if it was this book or something else I read that was similar, that when we talk about our gut instinct and our intuition, sometimes we're just supporting our own biases, essentially. We're supporting this is my gut reaction, is to do it this way. At times, our gut reactions, are really just our biases that we accept. And we're like, this is just how it's done here or there. Well, without this sort of, that layer of orienting, I love that, to bring us around to, is this really true? Or am I always acting this way in this situation based on maybe a racial bias, based on maybe brain fatigue bias, where, they've done plenty of other studies where the court cases right before lunch, everyone's guilty. Then right after lunch, everyone's innocent again because...
That was fascinating. Was that this book?
I think they referenced it in this book, but I know I've read the study elsewhere when you're like, oh, you're actually just really biased because you're hungry right before lunch and you're a little cranky. You would not say that you're cranky and everything's terrible right before lunch, but the reality is your brain is depleted and you're a little tired. And I think the study was done in Israel, I believe, where they looked at the same court cases by time of day, essentially, and they're like, whoa. And also time of day in the medical setting, too. Again, I don't think that was this book, but the late afternoon appointments your doctor is not going to be at their sharpest at 4 p.m., 3 p.m. as they were at 8 a.m. So I think where delay does not help you is maybe around accessing people when they're at their peak moments earlier in their day, apparently right after lunch for court, or right in the morning, I suppose, right after breakfast. But yeah.
And this is essentially why I've come around to believing that a lot more often than I intuitively thought, it is wise to put off making a decision, spend more time gathering information, and recognize if you don't have to make the decision right now, then don't. Figure out when that decision point is, and then just, cruise until you're there. Gather information, have fun, enjoy it, no stress. You don't have to make a decision right now. And then eventually you do. Yes.
Optimizing delay is great. Great lessons from this book. Well, I've had a great time talking with you, Dan. Thanks so much for bringing this book to my attention. I think we added some even bonus relevance to this whole book. Read the book about John Boyd if you want. It's fascinating. It's really about the Air Force and design, but his life was just really interesting. And the OODA loop, it was one of his ideas there. And I think we mentioned 5 other books too. Wait, you told me about
Teams for a New Generation.
Yes, Teams for a New Generation. That's what it was. Got a note. I'll check that one out. And thanks for coming on to talk today.
It was my pleasure. Like I said, thanks for the invitation. It's a great book. It's a great lesson in life. I'm glad we get to share it with your listeners.
Awesome. I'm glad I get to share with my listeners with you talking about it. So thanks so much. for joining us for this episode of the Books Applied podcast. I hope you enjoyed getting to know a new book and learning how to apply its ideas to make your work, sport, or life a little bit more awesome. For more leadership education-related content, including conflict management checklists, invitations to a fun free lunch that happens monthly, upcoming classes, webinars, and mastermind groups, please head over to wslleadership.com. Thanks, and have a great day.